When Spanish expeditions entered the Philippines in the 16th century, they encountered societies that challenged some of their assumptions about power. And one of the most striking differences was the position of women. Across different communities in the archipelago, women could own property, they could participate in trade, they could influence family wealth, and hold enormous spiritual authority. Some became powerful members of ruling families. Others became Babaylan, ritual specialists, healers, advisors, and guardians of knowledge whose influence could extend across an entire community. And then there is the mysterious story of Urduja, a warrior princess described by one of the medieval world's greatest travelers, but whose connection to the Philippines remains debated to this day. So, what was the real position of women before Spanish colonization? Were women truly more powerful than we have been taught? And what happened to that power after colonial rule transformed the islands? Today, on Echoes Before Empires, we're separating history from legend to uncover the remarkable world of women in the pre-colonial Philippines. And the truth is fascinating enough without turning legend into fact. Let's go. Before we begin, there is something important to understand. There was no single, unified nation called the Philippines before Spanish colonization. The archipelago was home to many different societies, languages, political communities, and traditions, so we should be careful about claiming that every woman on every island lived the same way. But early accounts and later historical research reveal something remarkable. In many Philippine societies, women occupied positions of economic, social, and religious influence that surprised European observers. Marriage did not necessarily erase a woman's connection to property. Inheritance could pass through both sides of a family. Women participated in commerce, and in some communities, separation or divorce existed according to customary law. But perhaps the most extraordinary example of female authority was found in the spiritual world. They were known by different names in different regions. In parts of the Visayas, one of the best-known terms was Babaylan. In Tagalog communities, similar ritual specialists were known as Catalonan. Many were women. Some were gender non-conforming men who took on feminine social and ritual roles. These figures were not simply the equivalent of European priests. They could be healers, diviners, ritual leaders, keepers of oral knowledge, and sometimes powerful voices in the political life of their communities. To understand the power of women before colonization, we have to understand the Babaylan. Imagine a community facing a crisis. A mysterious illness spreads. A harvest fails. A leader prepares for war. A family seeks guidance from the spirit world. Who do they turn to? In many communities, the answer was the Babaylan. The Babaylan occupied a position that Spanish missionaries struggled to fit into their own religious worldview. Their authority came from indigenous spiritual traditions. They conducted ceremonies. They preserved ritual knowledge. They interpreted signs. They healed the sick. And because spiritual life was deeply connected to community life, their influence could extend far beyond religion. That made them important. And during colonization, it could also make them dangerous to the new colonial order. Spanish missionaries sought to replace indigenous religious practices with Christianity. Traditional rituals were condemned as pagan or even demonic. Indigenous spiritual specialists lost authority as churches and colonial institutions expanded. Some resisted. Some continued their practices in secret. Others became connected to movements that challenged colonial authority. The decline of the Babaylan was therefore not simply the disappearance of an old religious profession. It represented a major shift in power. A system in which women and gender-diverse ritual leaders could hold extraordinary spiritual authority was being transformed by a colonial society built around a male Catholic priesthood. But the Babaylan were only one part of the story, because women also possess something equally important: economic power. One of the most revealing things about a society is not simply who sits on a throne. It is who controls property, who inherits wealth, who conducts business, and who has power inside the family. Historical research into 16th-century Philippine societies shows that women could possess significant rights in these areas. Property and inheritance were often connected to both sides of the family. Women could participate actively in economic life. They could engage in trade and manage property. Marriage was also shaped by local customs, rather than by the exact legal and religious system that Spain would later impose. In some societies, marriages could be dissolved. Property could be divided according to customary rules. But this does not mean the pre-colonial Philippines was a modern feminist paradise. It was not. Social rank mattered enormously. Slavery and dependency existed. Warfare existed, and customs varied dramatically from one community to another. But the evidence challenges a simple story in which women had no authority until modern times. In many communities, women were not merely standing behind powerful men. They were participants in the economic and social systems that made power possible. And some women were connected directly to ruling families. Titles such as Dayang could identify high-ranking noblewomen or princesses in parts of the archipelago. These women could become important figures in dynastic alliances, inheritance, diplomacy, and political networks. But when we search for individual female rulers from the centuries before Spanish conquest, we encounter a problem. The surviving evidence is incomplete, and nowhere is that problem more fascinating than in the story of Princess Urduja. For generations, Filipinos have heard the story of Princess Urduja of Pangasinan, a warrior princess, a commander, a woman so formidable that she supposedly refused to marry any man who could not defeat her in combat. The story can be traced to the travel account associated with the 14th century Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta. In his account, Ibn Battuta describes arriving in a mysterious land called Tawalisi. There, he encountered a warrior princess. Her name is commonly rendered as Urduja. She was described as a woman of status and military ability, a princess associated with warriors and ambitions of conquest. It is an extraordinary story, but there is one major problem. Historians do not agree on where Tawalisi actually was. Over the years, different scholars have proposed different locations across Southeast Asia. One famous theory connected Tawalisi to Pangasinan in northern Luzon. That interpretation transformed Urduja into one of the Philippines' most celebrated legendary heroines. But the identification remains disputed. We cannot say with certainty that Ibn Battuta's Urduja ruled Pangasinan. We cannot even say with certainty that Tawalisi was located in the Philippines, and that uncertainty does not make the story less interesting. It makes it more interesting, because Urduja exists at the border between documented history, geographical mystery, and national memory. She represents something historians encounter constantly when studying the pre-colonial Philippines: fragments, foreign accounts, oral traditions, archaeology, later interpretations, pieces of a past that do not always fit together perfectly. The responsible thing is not to pretend we know more than we do. The responsible thing is to follow the evidence. And the evidence tells us that whether or not Urduja herself was a ruler in Pangasinan, powerful women were not unimaginable in the societies of maritime Southeast Asia. Far from it. So, what happened when Spanish colonial rule expanded across much of the archipelago? The answer is more complicated than saying that women had power and then suddenly lost all of it. Colonial transformation happened over generations. Christianity changed religious institutions. Spanish law interacted with local customs. New political structures developed. New ideas about marriage, morality, family, and authority spread. The Babaylan faced one of the clearest challenges. Missionaries condemned indigenous religious practices and worked to replace them with Christianity. The spiritual authority once held by women and gender-diverse ritual specialists was increasingly displaced by a church whose formal priesthood was male. But indigenous traditions did not simply disappear. Some survived, some adapted, some blended with Christianity, and some became part of resistance to colonial rule. Women also continued to exercise influence in families, communities, markets, and social networks throughout the colonial period. History is rarely a simple switch from freedom to oppression. But colonization did transform the institutions through which power was expressed, and it transformed the way the past itself was recorded. Much of what we know about 16th-century Philippine societies comes from documents written by outsiders, missionaries, colonial officials, foreign observers. Those sources are invaluable, but they also have limitations. They were written through the assumptions of their own time. Indigenous voices were not preserved in equal numbers. Oral traditions disappeared or changed. Documents were lost, and some traditions survived only in fragments. That is why recovering women's history is so difficult. Sometimes the women were never recorded by name. Sometimes their importance was described through the eyes of men who did not fully understand their social role. And sometimes later generations turned uncertain history into legend. The challenge today is not simply to reverse one myth by creating another, it is to recover the past as carefully as possible. The truth about women in the pre-colonial Philippines does not need exaggeration. We do not need to invent armies commanded by rulers for whom no reliable evidence survives. We do not need to turn every legend into established fact. The documented history is already remarkable. Women could hold property. Women participated in trade. Women could possess significant influence within families and communities. Female ritual specialists stood at the center of spiritual life. High-ranking women belonged to political and dynastic networks. And across the wider world of maritime Southeast Asia, female authority was neither impossible nor unimaginable. Then there is Urduja, perhaps a historical warrior princess, perhaps a ruler from somewhere else in Southeast Asia, perhaps a story transformed through centuries of national memory. Her mystery remains, and perhaps that mystery teaches us something important. History is not about believing the most exciting story. It is about asking the hardest question. What does the evidence actually tell us? Why should any of this matter today? Because the past shapes what people believe is possible. When Filipinos discover that women were merchants, property holders, spiritual authorities, nobles, and influential members of their communities long before modern movements for equality, it changes the way history looks. Female power is not something that suddenly appeared in the modern Philippines. It has deep roots, but respecting those ancestors means telling their stories carefully, not turning uncertainty into certainty, not turning legend into fact, and not replacing colonial stereotypes with new myths. The women of the past deserve something better. They deserve the truth, as much of it as we can recover. The history of women in the pre-colonial Philippines is not a simple story. It is a story of power, spiritual authority, property, trade, tradition, colonial transformation, and historical mystery. The Babaylan were real. Women's economic and social influence was real. The transformation brought by centuries of colonial rule was real. And Urduja, her story remains one of the greatest mysteries of Philippine history. Was Tawalisi somewhere in the Philippines? Was the warrior princess described by Ibn Battuta the woman remembered today as Urduja of Pangasinan? Or did centuries of storytelling transform a distant ruler into a Filipino legend? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you want more stories about forgotten kingdoms, lost civilizations, and the history hidden between legend and fact, subscribe to Echoes Before Empires, because sometimes the truth is more complicated than the legend, and far more fascinating. Thanks for watching Echoes Before Empires. I'll see you in the next one.